In this presentation, I'm going to give you a brief summary of The Quest for Democratic Curriculum in Education, a chapter written by Diane Alken in a book that was published in 2020. Essentially, the purpose of this kind of presentation, let me just slide over here. The purpose of this presentation is to basically extend what you've hopefully already read in the article, or give you like a refresher on it, because you're still responsible for having read the article for this course. I'm just pointing out some stuff and basically trying to fill in some of the gaps that you may have with regards to some of these authors. It's quite a few authors in a very small space that you're introduced to, and some rather complicated concepts in some cases, such that I'm going to unpack them a bit in this presentation. Hopefully this is helpful. So, this article employs Dr. Karen Cooper's The 5 Contexts, right, for understanding curricula. This is one of the many different ways of theorizing or thinking about the applications of curriculum. So we'll talk more about that in a second. This is just the agenda. Rhetorics of curriculum, we're basically going to walk through Diane Alken's analysis of the kinds of rhetorics that define curriculum, ultimately that are constitutive of the autobiographical context. We'll then just briefly discuss Diane Alken's portrayal of the historical context, or at least her view through the lens with regards to these particular authors that she's categorized as constituting the historical context of the development of curricula, arguably in Canada, or at least North America generally. Then we'll look at the political context, or at least the way in which Diane Alken has applied the political context to some of these authors. And the postmodern context, which will require a little bit of explaining, because this might seem brand new to some of you, and that's great. Last but not least, the philosophical context will also need some explaining. It's not immediately intuitive exactly what Dr. Cooper and Robert White were referring to when they developed this really theory and way of categorizing and organizing our approaches or lenses when we regard curriculum. And yes, I couldn't think of a way to categorize this particular section, but given my own reading and background in this particular area, I lumped some of those authors into conscientization and emancipation. Among educational researchers, this is typically how people like Freire and Giroux are identified. Okay, and last but not least, we'll discuss what Diane Alken identified as beacons for change, 2 case studies of schools that have demonstrated applications of some of these more postmodern and, I would say, nuanced and relatively, let's say, hopeful approaches to curricula and to applications of curricula that basically incorporate a lot of the promising elements of the author's writings that are presented here. 5 contexts. So this is drawn from Robert White and Karen Cooper's Qualitative Research in Postmodern Era Contexts of Qualitative Research. You can get this in the library, by the way, if you want to check it out. It's a great read, but take a look if you want. It outlines this way of lensing curricula and, let's say, contextualizing, it's in the name, but a way of kind of a way of thinking about how to see and think through curriculum. I kind of describe it here as the intersectional relationships to help us, let's say, conceive of or contemplate the intersectional relationships among the assumptions, for example, political, philosophical, or autobiographical assumptions and considerations as they apply and also are conducive of curricula. We'll then walk through each of these contexts, and I want to bring it up right here that for the final assignment, it's highly encouraged that you employ the 5 contexts in your analysis, and partly because it's Dr. Cooper's specialty, this is her theory, and ultimately the course is largely structured around this particular way of conceptualizing curricula and analyzing it too. So, yeah, basically the autobiographical, as it sounds, it's basically thinking through the personal and the experiential, like the lived experience and how it relates directly to curriculum, like just being alive and how that demonstrates application and let's say the elements that are constitutive of curricula. The historical context, historical contextualization is always valid in really any discipline or any kind of analysis, and this draws a special attention to the value of historical consciousness, the historical moment, or contextualizing the historical moment to help us appreciate it. The political context, which is basically more the question of power and how power dynamics are active in the creation and the application of curricula. And the postmodern context, asking questions about, like, if this is modernity, if, like, Tylerian, which we'll talk about in a sec, the Tylerian, Baubidian perspectives of curriculum are modernist, then what comes after? Like, we talk about reconceptualizing curriculum, and these days there's even people that talk about how we've moved on from the reconceptualization argument, even in the CTL department. But yes, the postmodern context, thinking about people like Bauman and liquid modernity, and the question of flow as it relates to our existence as teachers and as learners. Philosophical context, last but not least, thinking through the principles that are active and really, well, there's different ways to conceive of the philosophical context, and we'll talk about that when we get there. Okay, historical context. So the people that were looked at, that were lumped in or lensed with this particular frame were William von Humboldt and Ralph Tyler. Now and John Dewey. John Dewey's lumped in here too. But yeah, anyways, we'll talk about those three. William von Humboldt established the primary education system in Prussia, which became the model for Japan and the United States. So essentially, William von Humboldt's often identified like as the father of education or father of schooling, because functionally he was one of the first people to basically popularize this idea of universal primary education, or at least the idea of like regimented schooling, which we take for granted largely now. But yes, there were points in the past when trying to educate everyone between at least to like a grade 6 level education, and I mean grade 6 as it would have been in the 19th century, where that was a radical idea, especially that it be publicly funded, right? But he basically established the roots of our schooling systems in a lot of ways. He oversaw the establishment of standardized examinations, so although we often attribute standardized assessment as kind of more of a 20th century phenomenon, it did have its roots earlier in the 19th century. It's, again, just the beginnings of standardized assessment. It's not like the EQAO. It's more like the question of trying to assess people in the same ways for the same purposes. And again, I use that language very lightly because this is, like, again, the earliest phases of these developments, such that it was just like, it's a question of giving the students the same test, right? If you're trying to assess a group for the purposes of the group's development and all of their growth. And yeah, he started thinking upscaling, right? The question of having a government regimented, publicly run, I'm not going to say funded, but publicly run schooling system. Again, this is partly why, again, why would they call him the father of schooling? Well, it's because he basically created the blueprint for pretty much everything that came next in the British Empire and globally in a lot of ways. Ralph Tyler. Okay, so you have the father of education or father of schooling, and then you have the father of evaluation. He basically created the context for what has become kind of the evaluation mindset or approach to schooling, right? And now he's evolving from like he's writing, and let's say he grew up in a rather behaviorist tradition, or at least like that's what his exposure would have been in the early 20th century, since behaviorism was pretty much in vogue. This whole idea that you could measure people and pretty much everything that was happening that involved people according to this idea or notion of behavior. Right? Which manifests in things like behavioral objectives, that you can aim for a particular kind of behavior or a behavioral product of an educational system. So from this seminal work, Basic Principles of Curriculum Instruction, we have what are now known as like the Tylerian principles or Tylerian questions. These are the four main questions that when people think of Tyler, this is what they think about his legacy. This is the questions of what are the school's educational purposes, right? So mandates. Basically, what's the mandate? What's the spirit? What's like the primary goal of the school? Like, is it a math contest school? Is it a art school, right? Like this whole question of mandate. This question of what educational experiences will likely attain these purposes. So basically, we have kind of a mandate, we have a goal, we have an objective, what means will get us there, like what kind of teaching, instruction will get us there. How can these educational experiences be properly organized? Like how could it be scheduled? How could the actual, like what's going to be the day-to-day function of this educational space, right? And how can that be like optimized? And then last but not least, how can curriculum be evaluated? Assessment, or really it's evaluation. When Tyler talked about evaluation, he's talking about like evaluation, like summative evaluation, or what we think about as summative evaluation, as a means of measuring development. So John Dewey is also included in the historical context, which is kind of interesting. Now, I made this presentation a while ago. I've just kind of updated it for the purposes for this class. I took this class a while ago and then also have taught this class a couple times, or helped Dr. Cooper teach this class. And in my studies before my PhD, I had encountered Hilda Neatby's work. Hilda Neatby wrote a book called So Little for the Mind, and she kind of eviscerated Dewey and the progressives, but she's got her own reputation for a number of reasons. But one of the things that she said that I kind of stuck with me was this idea that everyone has their own Dewey, which is a fascinating insight. Basically, Dewey is so idolized and he's just such a touchstone for educational theorizing and educational conceptualizations that ultimately we kind of project ourselves onto Dewey. And you can see this in other people and how they write about Dewey, and Hilda Neatby was kind of criticizing people for doing that. But yes, basically at the end of the day, if you ever get a chance, like read some of Dewey's stuff, it's fantastic. I think you have to read My Pedagogic Creed at some point in this course. But anyways, envisioned a curriculum that relied on reflection, nurturing the child, and on the principles of democracy, which is a pretty good summation of the progressive movement in education generally, going into like the 1920s especially. This question that the question of the child-centered educational system, right? Which up until that point, it was very teacher-centric and very transmissional teaching, what Freire would call like banking models of education. Yeah, and democratic, and basically this notion that you're teaching for the sake, or ultimately with the ultimate goal of citizenship, effective citizens, again, associated with the progressive movement in education in North America. So, yeah, progressive educator. He instituted to popularize the experimental school. So they basically gave themselves some kind of an exceptional goal for that school. And basically, they were just trying new things that had not been tried before for the purposes of just seeing what would happen. So some of these were pretty extreme if you go to research like all of the different kinds of experimental schools that emerged in the early 20th century, but ultimately just this willingness to think laterally and take enormous risks when it came to schooling for the sake of improving our understanding of education and learning, but also for student outcomes, like to help our students in ways that we hadn't previously. or like we, but like North Americans. The question of socialization and the question of the school's role in socialization. That you're not just, the school's function is not just to transmit knowledge to children, but to basically prepare children for society, which means they need to be socialized in order to be effective citizens, to be an effective participant in communities. And again, that was a relatively new idea going into the progressive movement, or it was nowhere near as popularized as it became as a result of the efforts of the progressives. So, historical context, just to sum this all up, I have a funny feeling Diane Alken lumped these particular authors into the historical context because this was the basis upon which and within which the rest of the educators, scholars of education of the 20th century operated. And much of their work was a response to these kinds of authors, such that, like, if you want to think about like the value of historical contextualization, the value of applying the historical context, it's to understand the way in which discourse interacts, that like people like Pienaar, people especially like well, Pienaar's a really good example, but even going as far as in the 70s, after his work was popularized, Freire, are responding to people like Tyler, to people like, well, everyone's kind of responding to Dewey, but they're not as, let's say, vicious with Dewey unless you're Hilden E.P. Okay, political context. We value normalcy. So this is a quote right straight out of the book, actually, but something that Diane Alken's highlighting for people is the idea that as a result of valuing like normalization or normalcy, or this question of like renewing and upholding norms, as a result of this, we are attracted to standardization, boundaries, and objectives that are constant in order to achieve or renew those norms, right? Such that it's kind of like cyclical. Which has consequences, and ultimately basically you're saying that within this structure, power has been negotiated to reproduce norms, and that's like the primary value in a lot of these educational systems, or at least that's how these authors critiqued those systems. So Franklin Bobbitt is kind of operating in the wake of Taylorism, or those four questions. And also, Diane Alken draws attention to the importance of the Cold War as contextualizing the developments in education and curricula and understandings of curricula in the 20th century. So Bobbitt, yes, discussed education as I would say a determinant of social progress, right? That people needed to be educated in order to forward this idea, this notion, or like to achieve progress. Progress is at the root of progressivism, such that we could argue, and one of the critiques of progressivism is that it's all shaped about capitalistic progress, right? So Bobbitt's perspective, though, was that he's still kind of a progressive educator, right? He still would have fallen within those traditions as being someone that is supportive of progress and, let's say, societal renewal or development. But his vision of society was very different than, like, his view of society and civilization was different than Dewey's. Bobbitt believed that the schools should prepare people for an industrial society, like an industrial mechanistic system. So he supported things like replacing classics with stuff that correspond with social needs, which at the time Bobbitt would have identified as capitalistic needs. Diane Alken's bringing to our attention in the chapter that people shouldn't be educated too much. They don't need to be educated too much, right? Which is quite different than Dewey's vision, as Diane Alken identified in the article. So Tyler's curriculum then is conducive to a normative, but like a normalizing or normalcy for the sake of capitalism, in generally speaking. As again, these are broad strokes. This is a very brief overview of these authors, But yeah, and yeah, another thing you can infer from this, as Diane Alken identified, is that society is static. Even though these people are attributed as a part of a progressive tradition, progress was kind of like a homeostasis, because although like it's this question that society, you shouldn't really upset the established order. You don't need to know more than is necessary to uphold the existing order. Okay, and yeah, the Cold War, essentially, the biggest thing to take away from this, as Diane Alken identified, the launching of Sputnik kind of, because the space race between the United States and the USSR was an extremely popularized event globally, and it was kind of a sign and signifier of success in the Cold War. Like, their technological dominance translated into political dominance, such that when Sputnik was launched, the United States, North America broadly, Canada to an extent, but mostly the United States, Americans were of the opinion that they had to catch up. And there was basically this entire societal zeitgeist that we need to do more with our existing education systems in order to beat the Russians. Well, no, it's the Soviets, not the Russians at the time. But so, the postmodern context. Is there anything I want to say about the political context generally? Just basically, you're just thinking about power dynamism and how that relates to the construction or the conceptualization of curricula and its application as well, right? Yeah. The postmodern context, which identified by Alken in this case, or how she's lensing it, she would lump or attribute Pilpinor, Maxine Greene, and Tadeusz, as well as, well, of course, Sigmund Bauman. But yeah, we'll get to all of these authors here. So the postmodern context, this notion of postmodernity, it basically just means like beyond, or the next level, or the next higher existence beyond modernity, however you want to conceive of that. And there's many different ways to think about what it means to go beyond the modern or modernity, because there's the problem with postmodernity is modernity, because there's already a lot of complications in identifying exactly what authors are referring to when they say modern. But anyways, yes, so William Pinar was one of the first author, full stop, to use career as a verb, or to really bring this to people's attention and popularize it, to think of curriculum as less of a static thing that exists in of itself and isn't really doing anything, versus thinking of curriculum as something that's evolving, something that's moving, something that's in motion, something that's a verb. This notion of career. So he highlighted the significance of, unfortunately, the significance of the individual's personal experience or autobiographical journey. So the personal, and really a tremendous emphasis on the personal that hadn't really been done before. Like Dewey identified, was a very a tremendous supporter of individualism, and but for the sake of capitalism and free enterprise, etc. But ultimately, supporter of individualism and individuality. But that's kind of where it stopped. It didn't really delve into the experiential side of education, as Pinar did. This question of narrative, right? The question of the ways in which our stories are indicative of, are constitutive of, and are ultimately shaped by curricula, right? That's a relatively new idea with Pinar and the Reconceptualists, or at least people writing around Pinar's time, 1960s, 70s. So, pivotal in the Reconceptualist movement, often attributed as the father of Reconceptualism, if you research that. So, essentially, Pinar's and the Reconceptualists are attributed as the primary movers from Taylorism to something new, to something more democratized, to something more, I would say, personalized in a lot of ways, almost narrativized, to a level of the individual and the individual experience, and drawing a lot greater attention to that, as had not been done previously. So Maxine Greene was very critical of Taylorism, was a prolific arts educator and really put tremendous emphasis on the imagination, the imaginative, and basically argued that, as illustrated here, education researchers have become too preoccupied with priorities, purposes, programs of intended learning, and intended or unintended manipulation. And that ultimately, the person is kind of left out in these kinds of systems or these kinds of ways of approaching or thinking about curriculum. And yeah, Green emphasized the value then of arts education as a means or conduit for meaning making and a way of making sense of the world that hadn't really been as emphasized as much before that time, or let's say as exhaustively. Hadn't been thought through to the level that Green did. Tedioki, if you ever hear his name, you should pretty much immediately think of the lived curriculum. It's a good thing to remember because ultimately that's one of his main, I would say one of the contributions he's most known for. Let's put it that way. So the curriculum for Tedioki comes from life. He argued that there are pluralistic identities embedded in the lived and planned curriculum, that ultimately all of the people that are participating in the creation and the experience of the application of curriculum, that there is this kind of space between people actually living and doing education, doing schooling, being in a school, versus what's on the books. And that educators need to acknowledge this kind of discrepancy between what people have envisioned as what should happen or be implemented as a result of curriculum and what it means to actually do it, to be it, to be there. And last but not least, and Sigmund Bauman is probably the signature postmodernist that we use really covered in this chapter as far as it comes to education. Bauman is known for, fluid modernity. He was very critical of what had become, or what he identified as, factory line schooling, right? That the only thing that differs, the only way our schools, or their schools and the schools he was describing when he was writing, differ from manufacturing plants, jails, military barracks, corrective institutions, or hospitals is in their main function. Essentially, even despite what they claim to be aspiring to achieve, they're all functionally, essentially the same in terms of their kind of factorization of their processes. Sigmund Bauman kind of redirected this, or at least drew a special attention to this in the case of schools, right? And basically helped move the discourse forward and encouraged a lot of more critical perspectives, including people like Henry Giroux, to basically delve more deeply into this question of the neoliberalization of education as a result of Taylorism and this kind of aspiration for capitalistic outcomes in education or through schooling. The question of identity, right? Which we now kind of it's just second nature for us to think about the significance and the value of problematizing or thinking through identity and all the consequences and all of the implications of identity formation, and just helping students work through what identity can mean for them and for their peers and for their families, etc. At the time, when he was writing, that identities that people have assumed are tentative, right? Tentative and easily exchangeable, such that people can put on certain kinds of acts. He drew a special attention to this as well, which basically, again, increases that tension between what people expect to be the case versus what is actually the case. It's appearance versus reality thing. It's basically just this discrepancy between what's idealized and what is actualized. What people are portraying versus like what's actually happening. Philosophical context. So one must both challenge the theoretical conceptions of the purpose of schooling and education as well as affect significant measurable actions. This is straight from the book. Now, the philosophical context we'll talk a lot more throughout this course. Diane Alken's article does like a very brief survey when discussing the philosophical context, but it's probably because you could talk about the philosophical context forever. It's there's a lot of depth there to unpack, potentially limitless or bottomless. Philosophical context, what you're basically looking for are what are the assumptions? What are the things that are taken for granted in order for us to challenge existing systems? Because often, like when we think about philosophical inquiry and we think about problematizing things philosophically, we're asking like, what are the universals? Is often one of the consequences. But ultimately, beneath the appearances, like beneath the theoretical conceptions that exist, theoretical constructs that seem to be active, what's actually going on? Right, this willingness and aptitude to go deeper. Conscientization and emancipation. Again, these are not titles that were necessarily used there. I created these ones partly because I'm familiar with these authors, especially because they have to do with my own research. But yes, Philip W. Jackson, Paulo Freire, and Henry Giroux. So critical consciousness and emancipation or freedom, teaching toward freedom or liberty. Philip W. Jackson is most known for coining the hidden curriculum. Again, I say reportedly here because a lot of people lay claim to having come up with the notion of the hidden curriculum, right? It's a bit of an intellectual turf war, honestly, if you read between the lines. Like people like Michael Apple also lay claim to that term. So, bottom line is, this notion of what's underneath of the curriculum and what is taken for granted and how the curriculum was created and how it's applied. So the hidden curriculum refers to norms and values that are implicitly but effectively taught in schools but that are not usually talked about in teacher statements or end goals. This is a quote from Diane Alken, who is quoting Jackson, right? This notion of the implicit, the subversive, the subconscious, like these elements of the curriculum that are so often taken for granted. Narrativized inquiry was also a term introduced by Jackson. This idea that we need to think about the way in which people inhabit the story of schooling, right? And the reality that even just by doing the most, like what we consider like the physicality of schooling, like just going to school and being in that space, being in a class, being around peers, like sitting at that desk kind of thing. Like what are the implications of this for learning, for teaching, and the ways in which we approach creating curricula and the ways in which curricula is implemented? I should say are implemented, but Paulo Freire. Okay, so Freire's phenomenal. If you ever get the chance to read him, he had a tremendous impact on the discourses of education. If you haven't already read The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, you should probably read it like 3 to 4 times right now, but it's a fantastic book. He stressed the continuous relationship between dialogue and critical thinking. So I put a conscientization up there. I don't even know if that's actually in the article, but this is one of the things that Freire is especially known for, is this notion of critical consciousness, or this idea of creating a kind of a predisposition for critical thinking about reality. Dialogue as the vehicle for facilitating that thought, that kind of thought, that kind of critical consciousness, right? So the redeveloped curriculum for the sake of critical thinking through dialogue is kind of like his legacy in a lot of ways, at least from that particular work. Did I have anything else for Freire? I don't. Okay. Well, anyways, Henry Giroux is fantastic, still alive, so it's not in the past tense here. He argues that power structures of curriculum and education must be reworked, replayed, and restaged. Henry Giroux is a critical theorist, and he might even have a problem with that term now because critical theory it's gone through a lot of changes over different conferences, but ultimately, he is concerned, or principally concerned, with the interplay of power in education and cultural reproduction. It's probably why whenever you hear critical theorist, you can kind of go and be relatively certain that they have some kind of affinity for Marxian or neo-Marxian tradition. So they're concerned with existing power structures and how power is renewed or centralized via existing systems, including, in Generu's case, schooling. So Drew posits that pedagogy is always implicated in power relations and must be understood as a cultural politics that offers both a particular version and vision of civic life. So basically that all citizens, all participants in democracy, all participants in a society are subject to a system of power relations, and that education needs to be situated among those relations. It cannot be thought to be separate or separable from those relations. That there's this kind of intersectionality or interconnectedness within and among culture. It'd be kind of a way of summarizing, or I'm doing I have a deep appreciation for Ruse. Ruse is a really complicated person to summarize, but anyways, he's got a very interesting perspective on things. This is something Giroux wrote. The school should become a participatory public sphere that is actively engaged in producing new forms of democratic community, organizes sites of translation, negotiation, and resistance. So, given his attention to the existence of education among power relations, he is concerned with how democratic community, how the approach to a more participatory style of education can cause or be conducive to a more participatory democratic community, which ultimately could be conducive to kind of, well, he's leading again in the Marxist approach, a resistance to capitalism, or like neoliberalism. He's a tremendous. He's very critical of neoliberalism if you read through Giroux's works, because again he's critical of all the consequences of neoliberal capitalism. Essentially, these movements and these authors are a part of a newer movement in education and curricula toward liberating and resisting domineering and overpowering and oppressive systems, which leads into a whole bunch of other discourses that we have now, like decolonization studies, etc., like decolonizing curriculum. Like the whole idea of minoritization comes out of these kinds of discourses. The question of minoritized students, how are they minoritized? Well, what are the systems of power in play? And how can schooling be a vehicle for undermining or resisting or overcoming or transcending existing power structures begins to change. So there are two schools that Diane Alken cites as case studies. And she opens up this section just by highlighting the new capacity that people have to engage with democratic education and curriculum, and we are able to communicate with each other in ways that we just couldn't previously, which has implications for the way that we think of the creation of an application of curricula, like the role of curricula, ultimately. Okay, so there's two case studies. They're quite interesting. Diane Alken can't go into too much detail in her article, but they're both very interesting, especially Quest to Learn. It's fascinating if you get a chance to research it on your own time. Right, Dragon Academy. It's an independent progressive Toronto secondary school. It's a private school. Unfortunately, a private school teacher myself. Very critical of the private system, but y'all know the job market in Ontario these days. So objective-based curriculum is very interesting. It's almost project-based learning, if you've studied that at all. Students' complete work concentrates on themes. So project-based learning is often formed around themes. It's like thematic learning that crosses all boundaries. Like it's like a question of like, I'm going to teach you a theme, and I don't care how old you are. I don't care like really what discipline you're concerned with, but finding ways to integrate and work with the intersections of different. So let's say like students, like age groups, like gender, orientation, sexualities, and like their habits, interests, hobbies, etc., and how they overlap for the sake of creating positive learning environments for collaboration. And yeah, you can read into that a bit more. organizing around objectives. If you have any interest in gamification, you should definitely check this school out. Essentially, they've tried to gamify like every aspect of the educational experience. They are taking advantage of their students who they know on the whole are digital natives, such that they're already familiar with a lot of the platforms that are especially effective or already equipped for gamification, or at least easy gamifying. So that's the premise behind the school. It's a pretty interesting place if you want to check it out. It's like a very successful school in the United States. And yeah, this is quoted directly from Diane Elkin's article, that basically they consider a school as a node. It's a good way, I think, to conceptualize the school as like one small fragment of a student's overall worldly experience, the life world of that kid. So thanks for joining me. I had to cut off my introduction because the way that this ended up recording, it only recorded like half my introduction, so I just cut it out. So for those of you who care, my name is Adam Hill. I am was TAing this course the time that I recorded this. I'm a fourth year PhD as of this recording, and I study the applications of axiological philosophy to dialogic inquiry for the sake of fostering empathy and humanization. And yeah, that's, if you want to talk about that, look me up.